It was a warm, bustling afternoon in the heart of a small town, with a scent of freshly baked bread from the local bakery mingled with the distant hum of traffic. Outside a corner store, a 16-year-old girl named Emma stood, visibly upset, exchanging heated words with a man. The crowd gathered, watching from a distance, exchanging murmurs, unsure of what was going on. Emma, her hands resting nervously on her pregnant belly, was caught in an argument that seemed to escalate out of nowhere. Out of the blue, a cop arrived on the scene, his boots echoing against the pavement. His sharp eyes scanned the situation, and within moments, he misread the tension and decided to intervene. He marched up to Emma, his voice stern as he ordered her to step back. The crowd went silent, watching in disbelief as the officer forcefully grabbed her wrist and placed handcuffs around her trembling wrists. Emma's face went pale, and for a split second, it seemed as though the world had stopped around her. Her breath quickened, and her eyes welled up with tears. "Please, I didn't do anything wrong," Emma stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The officer's face remained cold, unyielding. He didn't seem to hear her or care. His mind was made up, and to him, it was just another day of doing his job, no matter the circumstances. As the crowd looked on, their whispers turned into worried glances. A few onlookers pulled out their phones, recording the scene, while others shook their heads in disbelief. It was clear this wasn't just any arrest. Something about the officer's demeanor and the girl's vulnerability made the air thick with tension. The cop's impassive face said it all. He was untouchable. But what no one realized yet was that this arrest was the beginning of a battle that would turn the tables in a courtroom. Emma Matthews had always felt like life was a constant uphill battle. At just 16 years old, she was a high school student, already burdened with responsibilities most teenagers could never imagine. Raised in a small apartment with her single mother, Sarah, Emma's childhood was marked by quiet struggles. Her father had walked out when she was just a baby, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and a hole that no one seemed able to fill. Emma's mother, though loving, often worked long hours at the local diner, leaving Emma to navigate life on her own. Despite the challenges, Emma had always been determined to make something of herself. School was her escape, a place where she could forget about her home life, even if only for a few hours. She wasn't a straight-A student, but she was intelligent and ambitious, always striving to do better. Her dream was to go to college, get a degree, and eventually leave the small town that often felt like a prison. She imagined a future where she could take care of her mother, give her a life free from financial worries, and build a life for herself, a life that didn't revolve around the scars of abandonment. But then came the pregnancy. It wasn't planned. It wasn't something she could have prepared for. At first, Emma was terrified when she found out she was pregnant. The father of the child, a boy she had briefly dated, disappeared soon after the news broke. He didn't take responsibility for his actions and stopped answering her calls. Emma was left to deal with the reality of the pregnancy alone. Her mother, though supportive, was struggling to keep their lives together. The fear of raising a child in a world where Emma still felt like a child herself weighed heavily on her heart. Emma's situation was complex, and as her pregnancy advanced, so did her isolation. Her classmates whispered behind her back, some showing sympathy, while others whispered judgments. She felt the sting of both pity and contempt in equal measure. But through it all, Emma remained quiet. She tried to stay strong, to push forward, and find some semblance of normalcy. Yet, no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the weight of her circumstances. That afternoon, when the cop came for her, it was just another reminder of how fragile her life had become, and how easily she could be crushed beneath the weight of the world. The afternoon was supposed to be just another routine stop for Emma. She had walked to the local store to grab a few things for her mother, her mind preoccupied with the challenges of her day-to-day life. As she stood near the entrance, fumbling with her phone, a man approached her. He seemed agitated, and before Emma knew it, they were locked in a heated argument. The details of what sparked the confrontation were unclear to those who had gathered to watch, but from the outside, it appeared as though Emma had been defending herself against an aggressive stranger. The man was upset about something trivial, maybe a misunderstanding over a parking spot or a disagreement over an accidental brush of shoulders, but his temper quickly escalated. Emma, startled by his sudden outburst, tried to calm him down. She didn't want trouble. She didn't need more conflict in her already complicated life. She stepped back, but the man wasn't backing down. The situation was tense, but it wasn't violent. Emma's only weapon was her words, pleading with him to stop, to just let it go. That's when the officer arrived. A police car pulled up on the curb, its tires screeching in the silence of the moment. The cop, Officer Thomas, was tall and broad-shouldered, his face hardened by years of experience, or perhaps hardened by his own demons. His eyes quickly scanned the scene, landing on Emma, who appeared visibly upset. He made his decision in an instant. "Step away from the man," the officer barked, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. Emma froze, the words registering too late. She turned toward the officer, trying to explain that it was just an argument, that she wasn't in the wrong. But Officer Thomas wasn't interested in her side of the story. He pushed past her, not even sparing a glance at the man who had caused the disruption, and grabbed Emma's arm with force. "Let go of me," she shouted, her hands instinctively gripping her swollen belly as her heart raced. But the officer didn't respond. There was no sympathy in his eyes, just an icy determination. He snapped the handcuffs onto her wrists, ignoring the fact that she was pregnant, that her body was fragile, and that this was not the time or place for such an overreaction. The crowd stood frozen, some filming the scene with their phones, others just too stunned to intervene. Emma's legs shook beneath her, her breath coming in shallow gasps, but the officer's grip never faltered. His actions were swift and mechanical, a show of force that left no room for explanation. It wasn't about the truth of the situation. It was about his power, his control. And in that moment, it felt as though Emma's humanity was the least important thing in the world. As the officer led her away, her heart sank. She couldn't understand why this was happening. Why was she, a pregnant teenager, being treated as if she were a criminal? Was it simply because she had no voice in this world, no one to stand up for her? The injustice of it all settled heavily in her chest. This wasn't just an arrest. It was a statement, one that Emma couldn't yet comprehend fully, but that would change her life forever. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the case against Emma Matthews took center stage. The tension in the air was palpable. On one side, Officer Thomas stood with a self-assured, almost smug expression, confident that the law was on his side. He had done his job, or so he thought. The arrest was cut and dry in his mind. Emma was in the wrong, and he was simply following procedure. The prosecutor seemed to share his view, ready to paint Emma as just another rebellious teen who didn't know her place. But as the door to the courtroom creaked open, a hush fell over the room. The woman who walked in was no ordinary lawyer. Rachel Hunter was known for her unrelenting pursuit of justice, for taking on cases that others deemed hopeless, and for never backing down in the face of authority. Her sharp, dark eyes scanned the room, and for a moment, it seemed like the very air shifted. Rachel was a seasoned defense attorney, respected in the legal world for her impeccable record. She had built her career on fighting for the underdogs, those who were oppressed, overlooked, or mistreated by the system. This case, however, was personal for Rachel. She had grown up in a similar small town, raised by a single mother who had struggled to make ends meet. Rachel knew all too well the weight of being judged and misunderstood. When she read about Emma's arrest, something inside her snapped. She couldn't let this injustice stand. Her presence in the courtroom was more than just professional. It was a mission. She wasn't just defending a teenager. She was standing up against the abuse of power. The cop, though outwardly confident, could sense the shift. Rachel was here to shake things up. It was clear this wouldn't be an easy victory for him. The courtroom was thick with anticipation. Emma sat nervously at the defense table, her eyes darting between the lawyer, Rachel Hunter, and the stern figure of Officer Thomas, who stood at the witness stand. Rachel's presence was unwavering, her posture straight, every move deliberate. She had prepared for this moment for weeks, and the first few moments of her cross-examination would set the tone for everything that followed. Rachel rose from her seat, her heels clicking softly against the polished wood floor. She approached the witness stand with a quiet confidence that commanded the room's attention. Officer Thomas, sitting tall, returned her gaze with a stern expression, his jaw clenched. He was convinced the case would go in his favor. He had followed protocol, after all, or so he thought. Officer Thomas, Rachel began, her voice calm but powerful. You testified earlier that you arrested Ms. Matthews for disorderly conduct. Would you mind telling the court what exactly transpired to make you decide to place handcuffs on a pregnant teenager in front of a crowd? The question was simple, yet it carried a weight. The officer shifted in his seat, looking uncomfortable for the first time. She was causing a disturbance. I had to step in. Rachel tilted her head slightly, a faint smile playing at the corners of her lips. A disturbance? So, you're saying that a heated exchange with a man, which she was trying to de-escalate, was enough to justify this? She gestured toward Emma, still seated at the defense table. A disturbance worthy of handcuffing a 16-year-old girl in front of everyone, including her unborn child? The room fell silent. Rachel's words cut to the heart of the matter, and for a split second, it seemed as though Officer Thomas had nothing to say. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and cleared his throat before speaking. I had to ensure she wasn't a threat. Rachel's eyes narrowed slightly, and she stepped forward, raising an eyebrow. A threat? To whom, exactly? The man she was arguing with? Or was it more about the power you held in that moment? The subtle insinuation hit its mark. Officer Thomas's face reddened. I'm just doing my job, ma'am, he muttered, though his tone was increasingly defensive. Rachel didn't let up. She pressed on with calculated precision, her questions sharp and piercing. Let's talk about your judgment here, officer. You arrived on the scene, and without investigating, you immediately decided that Emma was a problem. Why didn't you question the man? Why was your first instinct to arrest her? Was this simply an abuse of authority? The officer stiffened. His eyes flickered with uncertainty, and it was clear his confidence was beginning to crumble. I didn't have time to question him, he stammered. Interesting, Rachel countered smoothly, her voice laced with skepticism. So, you didn't have time to gather all the facts, but you had time to place handcuffs on a pregnant teen? She turned to the judge, gesturing toward Emma's belly. We're all aware of the physical strain that comes with carrying a child, Your Honor. But it seems this officer was far more concerned with exerting control than considering the welfare of the individual he was arresting. The courtroom murmured with quiet gasps. Rachel's words hit harder than anyone had expected. Officer Thomas was growing visibly agitated, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Objection, Your Honor, the prosecutor interrupted, but Rachel was prepared. She glanced over at the judge with a confident nod. Sustained, the judge replied, allowing Rachel to continue. The prosecutor's interruption only fueled Rachel's fire. She was on a roll now, and she wasn't about to slow down. Let me ask you this, Officer Thomas. Have you ever been disciplined for excessive use of force in the past? Perhaps for being too quick to arrest someone without understanding the full situation. Rachel's voice was steady, but each question landed like a punch. The officer's face faltered. He shifted uneasily in his seat, clearly rattled by the directness of her questions. He cleared his throat again, avoiding her gaze. No, he said, though there was a hesitation in his voice that suggested he wasn't entirely truthful. Rachel knew she had him. The officer's defensive posture had shifted from confident to uneasy. Every time he tried to regain his composure, she would come at him with a fresh line of questioning, each more pointed than the last. The audience was captivated. Even the judge seemed to lean forward, aware that Rachel was dismantling the officer's testimony piece by piece. "Let me make this simple, officer," Rachel said, turning toward the jury now, her voice steady and unwavering. "What we have here is a case of authority gone unchecked. A pregnant teenager was arrested without cause, simply because an officer chose to abuse his power. And the only thing Ms. Matthews is guilty of is being in the wrong place at the wrong time. No more, no less." As she finished her statement, the room sat in a tense silence. The air was thick with anticipation. Rachel's strategy had worked. The audience felt it. The cop's confidence was gone, replaced by a look of doubt that lingered in the air like smoke. Rachel had made her mark. The officer was no longer sure of himself, and the case, which seemed so certain just moments ago, was now on the verge of collapsing. And with each word, Rachel made it clear, justice would not be denied. The courtroom, once full of subtle murmurs and tension, grew still. The air felt electric as Rachel Hunter, having already chipped away at Officer Thomas's credibility, prepared to drop the bombshell that would change the trajectory of the case. She had been waiting for this moment, knowing all along that there was one key detail the officer had either overlooked or intentionally ignored, something that would expose the glaring flaw in his entire approach to the arrest. She stood, her gaze locked on Officer Thomas, who had been growing increasingly defensive, shifting nervously in his seat as he tried to recover from the intense questioning. His hands were clenched, his jaw tight. But there was something different now. His composure had cracked, and his confident air was slipping away. It was as if he knew the next question would be the one that would seal his fate. "Officer Thomas," Rachel began, her voice calm but heavy with anticipation. "You've made it very clear that you felt Emma Matthews was a threat and needed to be arrested immediately. But what you failed to mention, what you failed to see, was something incredibly important. Something that not only changes the perception of this incident, but may very well render your entire case invalid." The room was silent, the tension palpable as everyone leaned forward. The officer blinked, confused but unwilling to show any weakness. "What do you mean, Miss Hunter?" he asked, his voice betraying a hint of unease. Rachel reached into her folder, pulling out a piece of paper, a photograph, and several police reports. She laid them down on the table with deliberate slowness, ensuring the audience could see the evidence as she spoke. "Officer," she said, turning to face the cop directly, "I have here a copy of the store surveillance footage, time-stamped to the very moment you arrived at the scene. I've also reviewed your official report." She paused, making sure to let the words sink in. "It clearly shows that when you approached Ms. Matthews, she was standing several feet away from the man she had been arguing with. She was not a threat to him, nor to anyone else." The officer's expression faltered. His eyes flickered to the photograph Rachel had just placed in front of him. It was a still from the surveillance video, showing Emma standing still, not raising her voice and not making any threatening movements. The only thing she was holding was her phone. There was no imminent danger, no escalation. She wasn't even close enough to be a physical threat to anyone. Rachel didn't give him a chance to respond. "This footage proves that there was no reason for you to place handcuffs on her, officer. In fact, you never even asked her side of the story, did you? Your decision was made before you even understood what was happening. You failed to evaluate the situation properly." The courtroom was silent. Rachel had hit the officer where it hurt, his lack of judgment, his failure to follow procedure, and his quick decision to resort to force without understanding the facts. She was painting him as not just an overzealous officer, but one who had intentionally misused his power. Rachel turned to the jury, her voice gaining strength with each word. "This is what we're dealing with here. A police officer who, rather than defusing the situation, saw an opportunity to assert control, to arrest someone who wasn't a danger. This arrest was not about upholding the law. It was about making a statement, about using his power against someone who had no means to defend herself." The cop's face turned ashen, his confidence evaporating before their eyes. His hands fidgeted nervously as the gravity of the situation settled in. The courtroom could feel the shift. No longer was he the confident enforcer of the law. Now, he was just a man caught in a lie, exposed for his failure to uphold the very principles he had sworn to protect. Rachel glanced at the judge, who looked just as taken aback by the bombshell. She had turned the tables, and now the officer's once unshakable stance was crumbling. This wasn't just a mistake, it was an injustice. And as the room simmered with the fallout of Rachel's revelation, the audience could sense that the case was slipping out of the officer's control. The turning point had arrived. Rachel Hunter's voice softened as she turned toward the jury, her tone no longer filled with sharp questions, but with an emotional weight that made the room hold its breath. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her words measured and deliberate, "we have all seen the footage. We've heard the officer's testimony. But I want to ask you now, how would you feel if this were your sister, your daughter, your best friend?" Rachel paused, letting the silence linger, her eyes sweeping over the faces in the courtroom. She could feel the shift in the room. The tension was still there, but it had been replaced by something deeper, something that made even the hardened prosecutor shift in his seat. "This is Emma Matthews," she continued, her voice breaking just enough to show the humanity behind the lawyer. 16 years old, pregnant, alone, already dealing with the uncertainty of her future, and now she has to contend with being treated like a criminal. An innocent teenager was humiliated, placed in handcuffs, while pregnant, and paraded through the streets, all because an officer decided he didn't need to take a second look at the situation. Rachel turned to Emma, who sat quietly at the defense table, her hands resting on her swollen belly. Emma's face was pale, her eyes tired, but there was a quiet strength there too. Rachel turned back to the jury, showing a series of medical records. "This is Emma's prenatal care. This is a letter from her doctor, showing the physical strain of this arrest. You can see here," she pointed to a highlighted section, "that this arrest caused Emma undue stress, which, in turn, could have jeopardized her health and that of her unborn child." The room was quiet. Emma's vulnerability, the very thing that had been overlooked in the officer's rush to arrest her, was now at the forefront. The jury was no longer looking at Emma as just a troubled teen. They saw her for what she was. A young woman caught in an unjust system, her life and future disrupted by a decision made without care or consideration. Rachel's voice grew stronger, filled with conviction. She is not a criminal. She is a young girl who deserves compassion, not punishment. This arrest wasn't just an injustice against Emma. It was an injustice against every young woman who has ever been judged unfairly. The courtroom was eerily silent as the judge, a stern figure with a reputation for fairness, prepared to deliver the verdict. His gavel lay motionless on the desk in front of him, the weight of the moment hanging heavy in the air. Emma sat at the defense table, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the judge. She had been through so much in the past few days: fear, humiliation, uncertainty. But now she could do nothing but wait. Rachel stood beside her, her face calm but intense, her posture exuding quiet confidence. She had fought tirelessly for this moment, presenting not just a legal defense, but a heartfelt plea for justice. The room seemed to hold its breath as the judge cleared his throat and addressed the court. After careful review of the evidence presented, and considering the arguments made by both the defense and the prosecution, this court finds that the arrest of Emma Matthews was unjustified. Officer Thomas acted in an overzealous manner, disregarding not only proper protocol, but also the well-being of the individual he arrested. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Rachel's lips curved into a subtle, triumphant smile, but she didn't break her calm composure. Emma, though, finally allowed herself to exhale. It felt as though the weight of the entire world had been lifted from her shoulders. The judge paused, his eyes scanning the room. "Furthermore," he continued, "this court finds that Officer Thomas's actions have caused significant emotional and physical distress to the defendant. A formal investigation will be conducted regarding his conduct during this arrest." The room erupted in a mixture of applause and murmurs of disbelief. The audience was in shock, but for Emma and Rachel, it was a victory not just for the case, but for justice. Officer Thomas, still seated, looked stunned, his once confident demeanor now crumbling under the weight of the judge's ruling. As the judge banged his gavel, the court's atmosphere shifted. Emma's hand found Rachel's, and for the first time in a long while, the teen allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things were going to be okay. The days following the verdict were a whirlwind of emotions for Emma, but they marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life. The weight of the injustice she had endured still lingered, but now there was a sense of empowerment, a belief that she could overcome anything. She had been given a second chance, not just by the court, but by the courage of one person who had refused to let her story go unheard. Rachel Hunter, in many ways, had become more than just Emma's lawyer. She had become a symbol of justice and integrity. Her relentless pursuit of fairness had shattered the walls of a system that too often overlooked the powerless. In the small town, Rachel was now regarded as a hero, a woman who had stood up for what was right, no matter the odds. As Emma walked through the streets, her head held high, she found herself speaking out more often, her voice growing stronger with each passing day. The injustice she had suffered no longer defined her. It had fueled her desire to ensure that others wouldn't have to face the same kind of mistreatment. She decided to finish school, to work toward a future where her child would be raised in a world where she could offer them something better. For Rachel, the case was more than just a legal victory. It was a reminder of why she chose to become a lawyer in the first place. To fight for those who had no voice, to challenge the system when it failed the people it was meant to protect. She knew the work was far from over, but she had proven that, even in the darkest moments, the power of one voice could change the course of many lives. In the end, Emma's story was not just about a wrongful arrest. It was about the triumph of justice and the transformative power of standing up for what's right. As the case came to a close, the ripples of its impact stretched far beyond the walls of the courtroom. The victory wasn't just a legal one. It was a victory for all those who had ever felt powerless, invisible, or vulnerable. The teen girl, once trapped in a system that had failed her, was now a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest of moments, the human spirit could rise and fight back. Rachel Hunter's determination had done more than secure a legal win. It had ignited a fire in the hearts of many. Her relentless pursuit of justice had exposed the cracks in the system, shining a light on the unfair treatment of vulnerable individuals, especially young women like Emma, who often find themselves dismissed, disregarded, or even criminalized for circumstances beyond their control. This case wasn't just about one officer's overreach or one teen's struggle. It was a wake-up call to society. It forced people to reflect on how we treat those who are most vulnerable, the young, the pregnant, the marginalized. The idea that authority figures could wield power without accountability was no longer something people could turn a blind eye to. Emma's story, once confined to the shadows, had now become a beacon for change, encouraging others to question injustices they might have once accepted as the status quo. The community began to come together in ways they hadn't before. Local groups started organizing discussions about police accountability, vulnerable communities, and the importance of empathy in law enforcement. More young people began to speak out, inspired by Emma's courage and Rachel's unwavering support. It was clear that the ripples of this one case would continue to grow, influencing policies and perspectives, pushing for a society where justice wasn't a privilege, but a right. For Emma, the experience had been transformative. She no longer saw herself as a victim of circumstance, but as someone who had the strength to take on a broken system and win. And for Rachel, the case was a testament to the power of a single voice, one that was willing to speak the truth, no matter how difficult or inconvenient it might be. In the end, the broader lesson of this story was clear. No matter how unjust the world may seem, standing up for what's right can ignite change. It showed that the resilience of the human spirit, when coupled with a relentless pursuit of justice, could break through even the most formidable obstacles. It was a reminder that each of us has the power to challenge the status quo, to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves, and to fight for a world where justice, fairness, and compassion prevail.